Hello, and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 209, The First Habsburg Emperor, which is also episode 7 of season 11, The Fall and Rise of the House of Habsburg. Today, we and the Habsburgs stride back onto the grand stage of European politics, not with a titan of history or a monarch whose long and fruitful reign resonates across the centuries, but with Friedrich III, better known as the Reichserzschlafmütze, the imperial arch-sleepyhead, or perhaps more fittingly, the imperial arch-dawdler. He ruled from 1440 to 1493, a total of 53 years, the longest reign of any holy or unholy Roman emperors. Yes, I am not counting Constantine VIII. And yet, it was also the most derided of reigns. In 1878, the historian Georg Voigt sneered, "He was not remotely capable of handling such far-reaching politics, leaving Bohemia to its own devices, the Hungarian throne disputes to the helpless queen dowager, Austria to the arrogant dynasts and the mercenary and robber bands." His light, simple hair, his long face with little movement, and his sedate gait betrayed a sluggish, deliberate nature to which any enthusiasm, indeed any excitement, was alien. His love of peace has been endlessly mocked, but it was based on a completely dull sense of manhood and honor. No prince was so easily consoled by such insolent and repeated insults. End quote. Modern historians are kinder, praising his thorough education and dogged determination to preserve what was left of the majesty of the Holy Roman Emperor, but even they can't avoid calling him flabby, underhand, and happy to sell out his friends and allies. So, not exactly the kind of guy one wants to spend 3 or 4 episodes with, but this is history, not Hollywood. The nice guys do not usually win by yanking hard on the levers of destiny. More often than not, it's the tenacious men of low cunning who weasel their way through that are the ones that are bringing in the results. And results Friedrich did get. At the end of his reign, the empire had changed profoundly. The open constitution of the Middle Ages had given way to a denser, a more structured organization. Why and how Friedrich III, despite all his many shortcomings, got to move the needle of German history is what we're going to look at over the next few weeks. But before we start, let me just mention the historyofthegermans.com website. That is where you find episode transcripts complete with images of objects or artworks I mentioned in the show, maps and portraits, as well as links to related episodes. There are season overviews, playlists by ruler, book recommendations, blog posts, and lots more. If you subscribe, you get an email with a full transcript every time I release a new episode and have just finished the full transcript, that is. Plus, if you go there, even if you do not come to support the show, it raises the profile of the website, which means it ranks higher in Google searches, which then means more people find the show, and that's a win-win for all of us. And so today we want to thank Lynn E., Chris S., Jakob, Simon T., Sepp B., and Gert-Jan K., whose generosity makes all this possible. And with that, back to the show. It is October 1439, and Albrecht, king of the Romans, king of Bohemia, and king of Hungary, is dead. This energetic and warlike prince was felled not by enemy action but by dysentery he had picked up on campaign against the Turks. He was on his way to Vienna, believing that if only he could once more see the walls of his hometown, he would survive. But he didn't. His wife, the formidable Elizabeth, daughter of Emperor Sigismund, prevented the body of the dead king to get to Austria, where he had wanted to be buried. Instead, she diverted the funeral cortege to Ferva, Stuhlweissenburg in German, the ancient burial place of Hungarian kings since Stephen I. Albrecht II did not have a son when he died. But his wife Elizabeth was pregnant. Her doctors assured her the child would be a boy who was to become the heir to the crowns of Hungary and Bohemia and the Duchy of Austria. The magnates of Hungary faced a dilemma. They were loyal to Elizabeth, the daughter of Sigismund, who had ruled Hungary for half a century, and hence her son was the legitimate heir. But then the Turkish offensive of 1439 had only stopped because of the disease. Sooner or later the Ottomans were going to be back, and probably sooner if they found out that the kingdom was ruled by a newborn. In other words, they needed a fully functional ruler. To square the circle, they suggested to Elizabeth that she should marry the King of Poland, Vladislav III. That would unite the forces of Poland and Hungary under a competent military leader, a leader who might even rally the feared Hussite fighters into a crusade against the Turks. However, Elizabeth would not hear these more than reasonable arguments. She was convinced she was carrying a son, and she did not want to squander the boy's chances of becoming king, nor her chances of ruling Hungary as a regent. As I said, she was a formidable lady. Still, needs must, and the Hungarians elected Ladislav as King of Hungary and were preparing his coronation. Elizabeth had to stop them. How? By using, drumroll, the crown of Saint Stephen. This was one of Europe's oldest crowns, by tradition a papal gift from Pope Sylvester II to King Stephen in the year 1000, though more likely made in Constantinople around 1070. Either way, it was sacred, it was ancient, and indispensable for a viable coronation. So, Elizabeth had it stolen. And we know all about this heist because the lady who snuck into the walls of Visegrad Castle, Helene Kortanerin, wrote it all down. How she placed some decoy ladies in waiting in the castle who let her in, how she filed through locks, removed and then replaced the seals, and sewed the invaluable crown into a cushion. Now, though Lady Helene is adamant she brought the crown to her mistress, Queen Elizabeth, safe and sound, today the cross at the top of the crown of St. Stephen is bent. Maybe someone sat down on that cushion when he or she shouldn't have. Well, who knows? The result was that Elizabeth had the crown and shortly afterwards a boy on whose head she then placed said crown. Ladislav III had to make do with a fake crown. But his army and his support was not fake. Elizabeth and her son, who she named Ladislaus after the Saint King Ladislas I of Hungary, came under siege in Bratislava. Very reluctantly, the queen had to seek support from her husband's distant cousin, Albrecht VI, the younger son of Ernst the Iron. With his help, she pushed Ladislav III out of western Hungary, but most of the kingdom was lost. As for Ladislav III, we will hear a bit more about him in a moment. In Bohemia, the situation was marginally better. The Bohemian estates were prepared to accept Ladislas on condition that he would grow up in Bohemia, plus that effective control of the kingdom was to sit with the Regency Council of Bohemian barons, not with Elizabeth. So Elizabeth and Ladislas decamped to his third realm, the Duchy of Austria. Given a weak and feeble woman could not possibly be entrusted with the affairs of the heir of so many crowns and lands, Elizabeth was forced to accept her Habsburg cousins by marriage as guardians of young Ladislaus, best known to posterity as Ladislas Posthumus. 2 years later, Elizabeth was dead, and her cousins, namely the elder Friedrich, took charge of the boy. Now this Friedrich, the fifth Archduke of this name, will soon call himself Friedrich III, King of the Romans. He was born in 1415 in Innsbruck, just when his father Ernst the Iron had come to Tyrol to protect it against Emperor Sigismund. He was tall, he was blond and broad-shouldered, and no surprise, given he was the son of Symburga of Masovia, a famous beauty who had lured his father to Krakow and into a serious disagreement with his family, and whose party trick was to crack nuts with her bare hands and drive nails into walls with her fingers, and no, she did not bring the Habsburg lip into the family. Friedrich had lost his father, aged 9, and his mother when he was 14. As an orphan, he grew up at the court of his uncle, Friedrich IV of the Tyrol. Having reached maturity in 1430, he took over Carinthia and Carniola, 2 of his father's lands, but not the much richer Styria. His uncle Friedrich IV refused to relinquish the guardianship and hence the income. It was Friedrich's younger brother, the already mentioned Albrecht VI, who forced their uncle to give up Styria. These two brothers could not be more different. Where Friedrich tended to avoid conflict and simply waited for nature to take its course, Albrecht was a belligerent man, always ready to use force to get what he thought was his. In other words, Albrecht VI was very much a son of Ernst the Iron, whilst Friedrich, if he resembled any previous Habsburgs, was in the mould of his Albertine great-uncles, who had spent their lives being pushed around by their Leopoldine cousins. In 1436, Friedrich goes on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. On the one hand, this was an act of genuine piety, but it carried as an added advantage a ban on any attacks on his property, and such attacks were ever more likely as his relationship with his brother had soured, and powerful families in the neighborhood could smell the young duke's weakness. In spring 1439, Friedrich's uncle, Friedrich IV of the Tyrol, had died, leaving behind a 12-year-old son by the name of Sigismund. Sigismund and the Tyrol was placed under Friedrich's guardianship. And as we mentioned already, in 1440, the heir to King Albrecht II, the baby boy Ladislaus Posthumus, had also become his ward, which led to the most unusual situation that for the first time in 77 years, all the Habsburg possessions were under the control of just one man, Friedrich, at this point still Friedrich V, Archduke of Austria. He may not be the legal owner of Austria, the Tyrol, and the ancestral lands that were now known as Further Austria, but he could use all its resources for his purposes. And he was acting on behalf of baby Ladislaus in the affairs of his kingdoms of Hungary and Bohemia. Now all this made Friedrich the up to this point most powerful Habsburg, which is one of the reasons that on February 2nd, 1440, the prince-electors unanimously chose Friedrich V of Austria to be the king of the Romans and future emperor. Friedrich let 3 months pass before he formally accepted the election. What took him so long? Now, one argument could have been that the title was now much more hassle than it was worth. Our ever-present guide, Aeneas Silvio Piccolomini, expressed it best when he harangued the Germans in a famous address. Quote, "You acknowledge the emperor for your king and master, nevertheless, he possesses but a precarious sovereignty. He has no powers. You only obey him when you choose, and you are seldom inclined to obey. You are all desirous to be free. Neither the princes nor estates render to him what is due. He has no revenues, no treasure. Hence you are involved in endless contests and daily wars. Hence you suffer rapine, murder, and conflagrations, and 1,000 evils which arise from divided authority." End quote. Yep, that is an accurate description. In the last season, we've gone through our fair share of rapine, murder, and conflagrations. The Mainzer Stiftsfehde, the Prince's War, the wars against Jacoba of Holland, the constant internecine warfare between brothers and cousins over ever smaller territories. It all reminds one of Sayre's law that academic politics is so vicious precisely because the stakes are so small. The absence of an effective central authority that could provide peace and justice had been a constant complaint since at least the passing of Emperor Karl IV. His successors, Wenceslas the Lazy, Ruprecht of the Palatinate, and Sigismund, barely ever set foot into the core regions of the empire. Wenceslas and Sigismund were far too embroiled in peripheral matters: Bohemia, Hungary, the Teutonic Knights, a schism. Ruprecht's scope had shrunk to his homeland once his journey to Rome failed to get past Milan. None of them was able to impose an effective ban on feuding that was backed by an effective court system and consensus amongst the princes. This vacuum was filled initially by the prince-electors, who in 1400 replaced Wenceslas the Lazy with the less inebriated but equally ineffective Ruprecht of the Palatinate, and in 1425 they tried to do the same to Sigismund. By that time the emperor held out. Not that he was able to live up to expectations then. given the chaos in Bohemia and Venetian pressures on Hungary. So from around this time, intellectuals, politicians, and writers of all stripes demanded change. The famous Reichsreform, the reform of the empire. Things needed to be put on an even keel. A system of courts needed to be established that prevented the endless feuding that ruined the land and weakened the empire against its enemies. On that, everyone agreed. But as Piccolomini had said, you are all desirous to be free and seldom inclined to obey. The constituent members of the empire, its limbs as they were called, struggled to coordinate. The electors believed they had been put in charge, and they could point to the Golden Bull as proof, but their small club excluded princes who were richer and more powerful than them, like the Bavarian Wittelsbachs and the Habsburgs. And what about the Brunswicks, the Mecklenburgs, the Pomeranians, the Landgrafs of Hesse, the House of Anhalt, the Württembergs? They were all NFI, and they didn't like it. Then you had the free and imperial cities, as well as those cities that were technically subject to a prince, but de facto independent, like most of the Hansa cities. And within the princely states, you had their estates, as we have seen in the Habsburg lands, in Württemberg, well, almost everywhere. So all of these entities needed to be slotted into a system that everyone could agree on. And so when we judge old Friedrich and say, why didn't he sort it out right away, just think about how we would go about changing a constitution that's 200 years old and deeply dysfunctional today. Okay, that is one huge, messy, wriggly can of worms, but not the only item in the imperial in tray. We still have our old chestnut, church reform. The Council of Constance, as we have seen, resolved one major issue, the schism that had produced 3 competing popes. But beyond that, it had been the first ever gathering of the European political, religious and intellectual elite, and it had been a massive party, but in terms of tangible progress beyond the election of Pope Martin V, not much. The fundamental issues of the quality of the clergy, the trading of benefices and the greed of the prelates had not been addressed. Instead, they had burned Jan Hus, who had pointed out these failings, with the consequences we have discussed in quite a lot of detail in previous episodes. Understanding its failure, the Council of Constance had mandated a series of subsequent church councils to be held to address these shortfalls. There were some failed attempts at getting things going in the decade after Constance, but in 1431 the Council of Basel got together. Now Basel was focused on church reform, and as it had become ever more obvious that the Hussites could not be defeated militarily, resolving this particular crisis. And in 1436 the Council of Basel achieved at least one of its objectives. The Compactata of Prague were agreed. Bohemia returned to the bosom of the Mother Church. Some of the moderate Hussite demands, like the Eucharist in the form of bread and wine and the expropriation of the church, were granted, allowing for the suppression of the more radical forces. As for item 2 on the Council's agenda, the reform of the church, this spiraled rapidly into a bust-up with the papacy. Martin V's successor, Pope Eugene IV, realized that a church council, in particular a sequence of church councils taking place far from Rome, posed a material threat to papal authority. In particular, since the intellectual leaders of the movement, the conciliarists, held the view that the council as the community of all the faithful ranked above the pope. Eugene IV first tried to simply dissolve the council, but could not cut through. Then in 1437 he ordered the council to move to Ferrara, ostensibly to facilitate an agreement with the Orthodox Church about ending this much older schism. Some of the prelates followed the order, others stayed behind in Basel. We're now at a stalemate. On one hand, we have the Rump Council in Basel insisting it is the only true representation of the faithful, whilst the Ferrara Council believes exactly the same. So we now have 2 councils, not 2 popes yet. That happened when Basel suspended and then deposed Pope Eugene IV, who in turn excommunicated the Basel Council. And so, to put the cherry on the cake, the Basel Council elected a new pope, Felix V, the former Duke of Savoy, who had entered a monastery and was by all accounts a most pious man. The schism is back. The imperial princes and the estates who cannot agree on much. They'd agree on one thing, that they really did not want to get involved. There were lots of sympathies for the council, in particular because many of the conciliarists took the view that secular rulers should take charge of the management of the church. But few princes wanted to go the whole hog and firmly embed the schism, as had happened when the French sided with the Avignon papacy in 1378. So, the Germans declared themselves neutral, and they required their new king Albrecht II to sign a neutrality pledge as a condition of his election, and that also then applied to Friedrich III. So, excellent, we have the empire in a structural bind and the church in a total mess. What else could be wrong? Yes, there are the external enemies. Now, we already heard about the Ottomans, but there are also forces nibbling away at imperial power in the west and north. The French kings had already taken much of what used to be the kingdom of Burgundy and were eyeing up Alsace. Meanwhile, their cousins, the Valois dukes of Burgundy, had gone from strength to strength. Holland, Zeeland, and Hennegau had now gone, as had Brabant. Luxembourg was close to go over, and Gelden was next. As the weight of Burgundy's possession shifted eastwards, they wanted to shed their vassalage to the French king and become full imperial princes, maybe even kings, maybe even independent kings. Then in the north, the Poles had taken the better half of Prussia from the Teutonic Knights, while Scandinavian kingdoms gained footholds on the southern shore of the Baltic. So, with three massive issues at hand, what the empire needed was the greatest emperor of all time, someone who combined the qualities of Augustus, Charlemagne, and Wu of Jin. And in their desperation, the prince-electors harked back to that age-old prophecy of Joachim of Fiore, that there would be a last emperor who would go to Jerusalem and who would usher in 1,000 years of bliss, a sort of rapture for everyone. And through some odd iteration in 1440, it had become common knowledge that that last emperor was called Friedrich. And they had a Friedrich at hand, our Friedrich V of Austria. And Friedrich, blond, broad-shouldered, looked the part. They conveniently overlooked that he'd already been to Jerusalem and nothing had happened, but maybe it will next time when he goes wearing his crown. And he may have believed that prophecy himself, at least we will later see that he was prone to such tales. What he did, though, was take the name Friedrich III, to appear closer to the legendary Hohenstaufen emperors Friedrich Barbarossa and Friedrich II, conveniently writing his ancestor Friedrich the Handsome out of history. And did the electors get a new Augustus, Charlemagne, and Wu of Yin? Well, sort of. They got Augustus' lack of military prowess, Charlemagne's cunning, and Wu's problems with his own family. But I'm jumping ahead. In truth, his reign started quite well. He accepted the election with great pomp and circumstance. It is one of these things that despite an otherwise quite modest lifestyle, he saw the need to perform majesty and imperial power. He did not get quite as brilliant at it as his son Maximilian, but he put on some great mise-en-scène. And one of those was his imperial progress to his coronation in Aachen. Given Sigismund's preoccupation with Central Europe, very few people outside of Nuremberg and Regensburg had ever seen an empire for decades. And these journeys carry huge importance in reaffirming imperial power and influence. In 1442 we find Friedrich holding court in Frankfurt. It's a brilliantly attended event where Friedrich issued the Reformatio Friederici, his first step at imperial reform. Now, many historians are dismissive of it and say, well, it's just a reiteration of existing laws that go back to Karl IV and Ruprecht of the Palatinate and Wenceslas. But fact is that all these laws had fallen into disuse. So passing a general prohibition of feuding, safety guarantees for priests, women, merchants, and even peasants, as well as rules about maintaining the quality of coinage, must have been most welcome, even if they formally existed already. And what mattered even more was if these rules could be enforced, which is where his actual improvements come in. Friedrich III established the Kammergericht as a replacement for the Hofgericht, Hof means court, as in the court of a ruler. The Hofgericht is the law court of the king or emperor, and it goes back to the early Middle Ages, and it's usually comprised of the senior nobles who were present at the imperial court at that point in time. And it usually deals with conflicts arising between nobles that are judged by their peers. The problem with the Hofgericht was that it required the imperial court to come around regularly and do the judging, which was no longer happening, since all the recent emperors had been busy abroad, or couldn't even leave their homeland. Moreover, the judges were laymen, not lawyers, and proceedings were rarely written down, meaning there were few precedents on which one could build a robust legal framework. The Kammergericht comes from the word Kammer, meaning chamber. These were courts who met inside in a fixed location. They did not require the presence of the emperor. They were staffed with lawyers, not laymen, and their proceedings were entirely in writing. The parties exchange writs, and the court passes a written judgment with its reasoning. The Kammergericht became crucial in the professionalization of justice in the empire. It established a whole new profession, the lawyers who argue their cases in front of court, not on what appeared right and proper, but based on precedent and the text of the law. And that law was increasingly Roman law as opposed to the somewhat unstructured and oral traditions of Germanic law. The Kammergericht was a big step towards Rechtssicherheit, the legal certainty, knowing where to sue and being able to assess the chances of success of your claim up front. But before we go, oh hooray, Friedrich III is the guy who gets it all done and all these historians who criticize him were wrong. Well, we have to touch some grass. Sure, he established these courts, but the enforcement of their judgments required the cooperation of the princes, and in case of the electors, wasn't even applicable to them and their lands in the first place. What it came down to was the standing and the reputation of the emperor, the quality of the judgments, and that would determine whether these courts were at all effective. But I still would argue it's a tick in the well-done box for the much-maligned Emperor Friedrich III. Sadly, it will be a while before the next tick appears on the scoresheet. Coming down from his coronation in Aachen and his promulgation of the imperial reforms, Friedrich went to tackle his second problem, the pending schism. On his way to Basel, he took a detour around Switzerland, where there were still some places with Habsburg sympathies. Even Zurich, formerly member of the old confederation, opened its gates and received the emperor with great fanfare. When he got to Basel, his welcome was again enthusiastic. The council fathers may have hoped the emperor would after all side with them against the pope. But something must have gone wrong during these meetings. All we are told is that Friedrich left in haste, and that shortly afterwards their Pope Felix V packed his bags too and returned to Savoy. And these two events seriously harmed the standing of the Council of Basel, and that of Friedrich himself, who was supposed to be neutral, and instead had messed things up. On the positive side, Friedrich picked up one of his most important advisors in Basel, and that was none other than friend of the show Silvio Aeneas Piccolomini. Piccolomini had been an avid defender of conciliatory ideas and had served as private secretary to anti-Pope Felix V, but by 1443 he was disillusioned and he was seeking a way back into the papal grace. Now, back home in Austria, the emperor was confronted with news out of Hungary. Now, as we mentioned, most of Hungary was now under the rule of Ladislav III, who was also the king of Poland. And he had been quite successful in repelling the Turks, who had once again tried to take Belgrade and Transylvania. In 1444, the Pope Eugene IV believed it was time for a final push to drive the Turks out of the Balkans and to relieve Constantinople, whose Orthodox ruler had just agreed to submit to the Western Church. And things looked promising as the Ottoman Empire was ruled by a 12-year-old boy, Mehmed II, whose father had just resigned. A crusade was called, an army assembled, comprised of Hungarians, Poles, Bohemians, as well as the Teutonic Knights, Venetians, Burgundian Serbs, and of course, Vlad II Dracul, the voivode of Wallachia, daddy to Dracula, not Dracula himself. Friedrich and the empire stayed well clear of these events. The battle that took place at Varna on the Black Sea was exceptionally bloody, with huge casualties on both sides. Still, the Crusaders lost. The young king of Poland and Hungary fell. His body was never found. The Ottomans returned in 1448 and swiped up much of the remaining Balkans up to Belgrade. These defeats meant that when Constantinople was attacked in 1453, no European forces came down landside to relieve what was left of the Byzantine Empire, bring an end to 1,000 years of history and one of my favorite podcasts, The History of Byzantium. Friedrich's lack of support to the crusade was not yet such a big deal for his standing, as the German lands west of Bohemia and Austria still felt covered by a wide buffer zone. But that would change. It was another invasion that got the empire falling out of love with Friedrich, not only because it was closer to home, but also because he himself had triggered it. Because Friedrich was, after all, not just king of the Romans, but he was also a Habsburg, and as such he wanted his ancestral lands back from the Swiss Confederation. That is what his trip to Zurich was about. Zurich had fallen out of love with the other members of the Swiss Confederation over some land issue, as one would. Zurich then sought support from the Habsburgs, specifically from Friedrich III. Friedrich was more than happy to oblige in exchange for the promise of a return of his ancient homeland. Now the other Swiss saw that as a fundamental betrayal, and a civil war broke out. The Confederates besieged Zurich. Zurich appealed to Friedrich for help. Friedrich was broke. Just in case you were wondering, he was and he will remain broke, as will most Habsburgs through the centuries. It is a bit of a feature, like the lip. Now, unable to muster an army he could send to relieve his allies in Zurich, he wrote or had his Chancellor Piccolomini write a letter to all of Europe. In this letter, which was formally addressed to King Charles VII of France, he described the Swiss Confederation as an abomination that threatened the very foundations of late medieval society. Every Christian ruler had a duty to suppress them and return the world back to its God-given structure. Whether King Charles VII was indeed stirred by his Christian duty or more mundane matters is not for me to judge. But he did answer the call, and he sent an army of allegedly 20,000 to Switzerland. This was a particularly rough lot that went by the name of the Armagnacs, mercenaries from all across Europe who had got their stripes during the 100 Years' War, which was just winding down. The Dauphin of France took these mercenaries to Switzerland. As it happened, they did not get much beyond Basel, where the Swiss were waiting for them. The battle ended in a draw. Yes, dear Swiss listeners, it was a draw. Of the 2,000 Swiss, 1,500 lay dead. But the losses for the mercenaries was maybe 4 times higher. The Armagnacs had enough and retreated into Alsace. Money to pay them did not arrive, so these guys did what these sort of people always did. They took whatever they believed they were owed from the locals. Their French commanders did not mind, as long as they did not do this sort of thing back home in France. The locals, many of whom were living on Habsburg land, asked their lord and emperor for help. Friedrich froze. His plan to get free soldiers had backfired badly. He did not know what to do and busied himself with standard administration and the law courts, pretending it had nothing to do with him. Meanwhile, his own lands and the empire in the west was ravaged by French soldiers. A year after the Armagnacs had appeared and no imperial help showed up, their local lords took the initiative. Led by the Count Palatinate, they mustered forces to get rid of them. And a few weeks later, the Armagnacs indeed returned to France and were reintegrated into the French armies. Now these disasters wiped out whatever goodwill Friedrich had in the empire. Nobody believed anymore that it would bring about 1,000 years of bliss. The number of cases brought before his brand new law courts dropped by 2/3. At the imperial diets he had enjoyed up till then, he was now on the back foot, having to defend his position, and so he didn't call them anymore. Things were dire. He needed to break out of this rut, and soon. His cousin Sigismund had now grown up and the Tyrol was no longer under his control. And even little Ladislas wasn't that little anymore. The day wasn't far when he might have to give up control of the Duchy of Austria and whatever role he now played in Hungary and Bohemia. Now he saw one road to get back. It was a road many of his predecessors had travelled, though very rarely with much success. And that road was the road to Rome. He wanted to be crowned emperor. And that would rebuild his prestige, and that would give him back the room to maneuver that the Armagnac War had cost him. But there was an issue. The Pope was not going to crown him unless the schism was resolved. Eugene was clear: dissolve the Council of Basel and I crown you, but not before. The Council of Basel was rapidly losing ground, and even its supporters were coming round to the idea that a compromise with Pope Eugene IV needed to be found. The question was, on what terms? Since the Council of Constance, several European monarchies had made arrangements with the papacy that regulated the influence of Rome in matters of what would rapidly become national churches. For instance, France had issued the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges in 1438 that removed almost any papal influence over the Gallican Church, in particular it cut Rome off from the income of the French Church. England had passed the Statute of Provisors and the Statute of Praemunire even earlier in 1351 and 1353, limiting again papal influence in the election of bishops and abbots. It was therefore rational for the imperial church to expect a similar arrangement to be negotiated by their emperor Friedrich III. The three main areas of contentions were A. Who elects the bishops and abbots? B. The payments of the so-called annates, the passing through of the first-year income of a benefice to Rome, and C. The practice of benefice holders to appoint someone else to perform the office they were appointed to. The settlement that Friedrich and his aides negotiated said that A. Elections of bishops and abbots should be free, however, the Pope can overrule them if he has a worthier candidate. B. That with the exception of a listed set of bishoprics and abbeys, annates had to be paid to Rome. And on C. That the ban on having stand-ins was lifted. Basically, Friedrich III handed Pope Eugene everything and the kitchen sink. The Pope had much more influence on church appointments in the empire than he had anywhere else in Europe. Moreover, his fiscal powers, in particular annates and indulgences, were a significant burden. On some rough estimates, the empire now covered 25 to 30% of the papal income, far more than France and England, and only second to the papal states in Italy. This agreement that went on to become known as the Concordat of Vienna did resolve the conflict for now, but it started another, more underground movement where broad sections of the clergy and the population complained bitterly about the overbearing influence of Rome, adding to the undercurrent that broke through in the Reformation. So nobody can tell me that Friedrich III's reign had been of no consequence. So, what did he get in return? Well, two things he really cared about. The first was control of the church in the Habsburg lands, including the establishment of the much-longed-for bishopric of Vienna. 80 years ago, his great-uncle Rudolf the Founder had built the Church of St. Stephen in Vienna as a cathedral, complete with cathedral canon, but no bishopric had been forthcoming. Friedrich III fulfilled this long-held ambition. And the other concession he received was his coronation as emperor. He travelled to Rome, bringing with him his whole family, his brother Albrecht VI and his wards, Ladislas Posthumus and Sigismund of the Tyrol. And to complete the picture, he got married there too, to Eleanor of Portugal. He was already 38 years old, and this was the first time he got married. As with his general sluggishness, his libido was clearly weak. There were no reports of any relationships to neither men nor women before or after his marriage to Eleanor, something quite unusual at the time. His uncle and nephew of Tyrol were well known for their extracurricular activities, as was his brother. Anyway, on March 19, 1452, Friedrich III was crowned emperor in St. Peter's in Rome, as was his wife. His family stood by him in a great display of Habsburg unity, and the coronation was followed by splendid festivities hosted by the new Pope, Nicholas V. This must have been the most harmonious imperial coronation ever. It was also the last to take place in Rome, and the last that was considered a true elevation in rank. Friedrich's successors will call themselves emperors from day one. No papal confirmation required. And as the procession was trundling back home towards Austria, Friedrich may have been contemplating whether his newfound status as emperor plus the elevation of Vienna to a bishopric was worth throwing the German church under the bus. Well, the answer to that will be in next week's episode, and I hope you will join us again. If you find all this worth supporting, go to historyofthegermans.com/support, where you can find various options to keep this show on the road and advertising free.